Today we're reading from Exodus chapter 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring to you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still."
Imagine for a moment you're with a large group of people you know well. You have a plan. That plan is to go and play rugby at Murrayfield and beat the world's best team. Things start. The Scotland team rally. The first half doesn't go so well. That plan seems to have hit a hard reality. The reality that this French side are absolutely phenomenal. The reality that we ourselves are not. But yet they hold on to that promise, don't they? We are better than this. I would love to know what was said in the Scottish dressing room at Murrayfield yesterday at half-time, and I don't think I'm the only one. In fact, I'm considering stopping supporting England later this year as the World Cup rolls around. Sometimes we can set out with a clear plan and vision for where God is leading us, for where we are going, for what He is going to do. And the heart of that is so good, it's so strong, it's so clear. But the reality comes through, and we find ourselves despondent, despairing at that plan. Like Israel in this text, we need to remember the promise that God gives to us. The beginning of this passage we've had today, God tells Moses the plan. Going to take the people to this place, go and camp there and stay between the sea and the mountains. You see, on the Sinai Peninsula, you get this lovely V shape. And if you go down that V shape, if you keep on going to the point where perhaps they cross the Red Sea, you'll realize that on one side there are mountains, and on one side is the sea, and it's a dead end. Moses, it's likely, will have known this. Having lived in Midian, the other side of the Red Sea, for 40 years, he knows this wilderness. He knows the place where God is leading them. And he knows it's a dead end. He trusts the plan of God. Now, I don't know about you and other plans you may have had, but I find that sometimes my plans do not go very well. Last year, my family and I were involved in a charity bike ride, so before that bike ride, I thought it's a good idea to give my bike a service. Now, my friends will tell you that I should do this more regularly. In fact, they will frequently tell you, Matt needs to clean his bike. And so as I did this, as I tinkered with this component on my bike, I was horrified when I snapped it. And the first thing I did was blame my tools. And the second thing I did was blame my bike. And the third thing I did was call the local bike shop and say, "Can I come now, please? What have you got?" Sometimes we don't know the full extent of the plan because we don't know all the parts. What I had forgotten in fixing my bike was that in not looking at that part of the bike for 7 years, of course it was going to break. As God tells that plan to Moses, he doesn't tell Moses all of the details of the plan. He tells him just enough of it. He leads Moses to that place and just says, "I will gain my glory over Pharaoh." Nothing of how, nothing of what comes next, which will be covered in next week's service, and I'm not allowed to talk about the really, really good bits. He tells us just enough. There's a psalm that encompasses this, Psalm 139, and specifically verse 6, which is coming up on the screen in just a moment. The idea that when God leads us, when God guides us through things, that there is an element that some of that knowledge is just too wonderful for us to understand. It is too much for us to know all of the details of that plan. I had a friend years ago when I lived in Guildford, just south of London, and this guy Roger was absolutely amazing. I remember the first time I really got to know him. It was Father's Day, no one was at his house. He saw me and said, "Matt, do you just want to come for lunch with me?" And we had a glorious day chatting. Years later, he came to my youth group and talked about his experiences of following God's plan and not knowing all the details. Now, to this day, Roger is still the only lawyer I know who has been in prison. He used to be a Bible smuggler, and he spent his time smuggling Bibles from the West through the Iron Curtain into the Soviet Union, and he got caught. Having lived in an Eastern Bloc prison, surviving eating food out of bins, he said this to the young people there that night, and it stays with most of them still that I'm in touch with. "I knew I was in a safe place because I had followed God's plan. And I knew he would get me out of there. Now it happened the church in Guildford was praying for his release so that he could come and study law there. And they gathered round him when he did, when he finally arrived, this church that had been praying for this young man's release. It stayed with Roger. His story will stay with me, I hope, for many years to come. Because he taught me that at the heart of the matter of following God, there is a greater reality. There is more than can be seen. I don't think Roger would have followed God as clearly as he did had he known where it might lead him. But when he found himself there, his heart was in the right place to say, "I believe and trust in him. I believe and trust in God who is greater than the predicament I find myself in now." Moses is in that place. He trusts God. The narrative of the previous 11 chapters of Exodus are really showing the way that God brings Moses on in trust. And now Moses needs to do the same with the people of Israel. He does the same with us. God does this for us too, as he leads us through life. The problem is things will come up like they do for Israel, like they do with Pharaoh coming to them at this time. You see, there are many great things that compound us in our plans to follow God. we can question whether what we consume, whether the barriers that stand between us in everyday life are what really build us into what we are doing. Shanks, can I have the next slide up? Thanks. Other way. Sometimes we can find that things in life are so insurmountable that the realities of what we're told about ourselves, what we see projected into our phones and computer screens, through our television screens, this is what you need to make your life better. This is the recipe for self-improvement. This is the way out of the predicament you find yourselves in. Well, actually, all of those powers of this world, all of those idols, don't have the same power of Christ. There's a wonderful truth in this passage as well with Pharaoh. God says, I will make my glory known through Pharaoh. He hardens Pharaoh's heart. He gets Pharaoh to chase the people so that they would see that God is greater than all of the truths they have ever known in their entire lives. God is greater than the God of the lands of Egypt where they have lived their entire lives so far. Now, it's a really challenging thing to unpack why God does this to Pharaoh. Why is it fair? The great truth for us today is that God does not need to do that again in the same way. You see, God has made his greater revelation to us through Jesus Christ, through the cross. The greater revelation is there for us to see and us to base our lives upon as we believe and trust in him. Now, that all sounds really simple so far, doesn't it? We can have a plan. We need to get our hearts in the right place. We follow Jesus. All will be good. As our passage continues, that's not the case. In fact, Israel cry out. The reality of what they're facing is too much for them to bear. You see, they can forget those promises. They can forget that there is a plan in place. And instead, with this huge army bearing down upon them, I can imagine the reaction. In fact, in my head, it goes a bit like this. It's a trap. Because sometimes what we face can feel so much greater than the plan we're trying to follow. So much greater than where our heart has been in following God. So much greater because the painful realities of what we actually face seem to not live up with what we've thought that promise will be. The thing is that this is reality. The cross of Christ is a reality. The fact that God suffers on behalf of his people and with his people is the reality for us today. Now, in the text, the people of God forget that momentarily. They forget what is really happening, and they make up a false reality instead. It would have been better for us to serve under the Egyptians. We didn't have it that bad, did we? They've forgotten the stark realities of what their life has been like. Now, that can be the same for us, can't it? It's quite easy sometimes when things do start going wrong, and they do, don't they? To create a false reality. If only we'd done this, if that was different, if God had been different. I know for my wife and I, we found this to be the case some years ago. And apologies if anyone feels stirred or upset by this story. Please do talk with someone, myself, with Dave, before you leave today. You see, in 2019, I quit my job right at the end of the year as a teacher, and the plan was that I would go through my interviews and I would start training to be a minister in 2020. At the time, my wife was due to move to a hospital in South London, and so things were opening up. Plans were going ahead. I had my interview and it said wait a year, and I was a bit gutted. But then during 2020, In amongst everything else that was happening, we finally found out that we were expecting our second child. And we were delighted. And the plan, the timings just seemed to work. But unfortunately, we didn't have the child. The worst news came through. And we found ourselves despairing. What of that promise? What of the way that things work? What of where we were going? Now, we clung on to the promises of God. We clung on to the fact that we felt that I was called to train as a minister, but we started giving up the details of that plan. Because of my wife's work in a hospital, she had to tell work straight away. Imagine that. We had to tell them before we could tell our families, really. And because of that, they'd planned where she was due to go next, and they changed it. So when we found out that we were no longer having this child, we were told, actually, the position that we had opened up for you, we need to move it. We're going to move it round. And they did this so well. But they outlined our options. You can either go to North London or to Cambridge next. All of a sudden, the broken reality of what we'd been doing, we saw a path to a place that we didn't see an option to go to before. You see, had anyone asked me, well, where do you really want to study? I'd have said probably Ridley Hall, maybe Wycliffe. I really value the way they do training. I really value what they stand for. But that wasn't an option. Now, I don't think God caused that incident. I think God used that incident. I think it is wholeheartedly the way that God brought us to Cambridge. My wife agrees. She knows we both share this story. The promise of God was there. And he did not tell us the details of that plan. But he was there with us in the suffering, in the painfulness of that reality, wholeheartedly giving us the promise. Not that things would be better, but that we were walking his path, his plan. You see, when Moses answers the people of God in this text, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. God's promise of his plan and his direction is greater than any heart problem we can face. Any issue that compounds ourselves, whether it's one that comes from within us or one from without of us. He leads and guides his people, not for the promise of an easy life, for smooth sailing and easy waters, but to be with us wherever we will go, wherever we will follow his promise. He is there. And the whole purpose of God revealing himself to God's people in this way, in this text, is to show them that he is not just God in Egypt or of the Hebrew people at that time, but that he is God who is with them in every aspect of life, wherever they go. God goes before each of us today as well. You see, when we moved to Cambridge, things were challenging. And one of the things that I had prayed was that we would be a real blessing to the people around us. I felt quite stirred that we would have neighbours who that we were going to tell the gospel to. And when we finally were able to start meeting our neighbours, God taught me something else. I have people on the ground here already, Matt, and they're here to bless you first. It was a fantastic repositioning of God's promise and plan for how we'd followed it so far. I do not know the circumstances you face today, but I can tell you, based on this passage and the experiences I've had of God so far in my life, that there is a plan, that there is a path to walk, a way of following him. There is a heart to this as well, and he will lead you and shape that heart through the challenges you face. And when the temptation is there to do what I do, blame my tools, blame the other things around me, look outward and say, if only that, this, or when. Instead, God changes right in here. And the reality, when it's painful, when it's hard, when it doesn't make sense, he is there also. He is there, leading, guiding, making paths you could never see coming. Because his promise is that, follow me and I will make the way for you. I will make your paths straight through the wilderness. If that stirred something in you today, don't leave this place without praying, without coming to the table and acknowledging God. If today you aren't able to say, I believe and trust in him, I would encourage you to do so, to take that step of saying, there is a God of the heavens and the earth. He has made himself known through Jesus Christ, through that cross, and that self-revelation of his love is greater than anything any of us will ever face in our lives, even when things seem too great for us to bear.